the stranger comes. What was going on? Helen had known all day that something was. The house had been cleaned from top to bottom. Even the guest room had been opened and aired. Wonderful smells kept coming from the kitchen, and everyone was busy, much too busy to bother with her. Late in the afternoon, Helen felt her mother put on her hat and her gloves. Helen had learned long ago that this meant her mother was going somewhere. So she held on to her mother's skirt. She wanted to go too. But Mrs. Keller pulled away gently and drove off in the carriage alone. Whatever was going on, Helen didn't like it. She was 6 years old, but she had no words to tell how she felt. Every once in a while, she shook her head sadly, and she waited. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, Helen stood very still. She seemed to be listening as hard as she could. In a way, she was, not with her ears, but with her whole body. Helen couldn't hear the loudest noise in the world, but sometimes she could feel things slam or shake around her. She could feel their vibrations coming through the air and the ground. Now she felt the thud of horses' hooves, the vibration of the carriage wheels coming back up the drive. The carriage stopped in front of the porch. Now Helen felt footsteps coming toward her across the porch floor. It must be her mother. Her mother was home at last. Helen held out her arms and felt herself being scooped up. But this wasn't her mother. These were a stranger's arms. The stranger was Miss Annie Sullivan. She had come all the way from Perkins Institute to try to help Helen. But, of course, Helen didn't know this. All she knew was that a stranger was holding her close. And Helen didn't like to be held by strangers. So she kicked and she twisted. She tried to break free. But the stranger's arms only tightened around her. Helen began to growl. "Let her go, Miss Annie," Helen's father cried, "or she will hurt you." The arms loosened and Helen sprang free. Helen did not like strangers, but she was curious about them. So now she came back. She patted her hand across Annie Sullivan's face and down over her dusty traveling dress. Annie laughed. "I can see that she doesn't like to be touched, but she isn't a bit frightened, is she?" Mr. Keller took his time answering. "No, Miss Annie," he finally said, "and I think that you will sometimes find that that's a problem." Early the next morning, Mrs. Keller led Helen into Annie Sullivan's room. It was time for the first lesson to begin. Helen didn't know this, of course, so she just wandered around the room, touching all the new things the stranger had brought with her. One of the first things she found was Annie's suitcase, lying open on the bed. Her curious hands plunged inside. And what was this? Helen's face lit up. She knew right away. It was a doll. She had others in her room. She wanted this one, too. Helen snatched it out of the suitcase and hugged it close. "It's a present for Helen from the little blind girls at Perkins," Annie told Mrs. Keller, "and it's also as good a place to begin as any." She picked up Helen's hand. Helen started to tug away. But then she stopped. What was the stranger doing with her hand? "This is called the finger alphabet," Annie explained to Helen's mother. "It's a way of talking to the deaf. I am making the shapes of the letters D-O-L-L into Helen's palm. Then I will take her hand and run it over the real doll in her arms. You see, first the word, and then what the word stands for. The word and what it stands for again. I am simply trying to connect these two things in her mind." "Look, Miss Annie," Mrs. Keller cried. Helen is making those movements too. And she was. Slowly, Helen Keller's fingers were making the shapes of the word D-O-L-L, doll. What a quick little monkey you are, Annie murmured, and she bent down to help. Then she saw the look on Mrs. Keller's face. No, no, you must not get your hopes up so soon, Annie said quickly. Helen has learned how to make the shapes of her first word, and very fast, too. But she does not know that these shapes stand for all the dolls in the world. She does not know they have meaning. Now Annie turned back to Helen. So, come on, let's go on with the lesson. Annie pulled the doll out of Helen's arms. She meant to give it back as soon as Helen spelled the word D-O-L-L again. But Helen didn't know this. All she knew was that the stranger was taking her doll away from her, and she wanted it back. Again and again, Helen reached for the doll, but her hand only touched empty air. She began to growl. Look out, Miss Annie, Mrs. Keller cried. But her warning came too late. Helen came charging. Her fist shot out, and she hit Annie Sullivan right in the mouth. Helen could not hear her pain-filled cry, but she could feel the stranger jerk away. She smiled. Oh, let her have the doll, Mrs. Keller cried. It's the only way to calm her. No, Annie said, there is another way. Helen must learn self-control. But Helen doesn't know what self-control is, Mrs. Keller answered. She doesn't know how to keep her temper. Then that is the first lesson I must teach her, Annie Sullivan said, for I do not think I can teach her anything else until I do. Helen came charging again, but this time Annie was ready for her. She grabbed Helen's arms and hung on as tight as she could. Helen kicked and screamed for quite a while. Then suddenly she went limp. So, my girl, Annie said, have you had enough? Are you ready to go on? But it was a trick. As soon as Annie let go, Helen ran from the room. She would not come back all day. Helen slept as well as ever that night, but Annie Sullivan didn't. She lay in bed and thought about Helen. Annie had been in Tuscumbia for only one day, but already she knew that everyone in this house felt too sorry for Helen. They had let her have her own way for years. Now she was badly spoiled. And that must stop, Annie thought, for how can I reach her mind while she rants and rages like a wild animal? No, I must be loving, but firm. That's the best way to help Helen.